In the first video for this lesson, we discussed the rhetorical considerations and design practices that help us create or use graphics effectively. And we talked about when to use different types of data displays, tables, pies, charts, bar or column graphs, and more. In this video, I'm going to share some examples of poor formatting choices. Some of these are just bad because the designer didn't design the data displays effectively. Some of them, however, are bad because the designer deliberately excluded or obscured data. So this video should help you prepare to be a more careful, critical reader and user of data displays and information graphics. And it should also help further prepare us for Module 2, our main activity for this lesson. This is our first example. Admittedly, the quality is poor, but even if the quality was excellent, the labels here are almost impossible to read and make sense of, and the arrangement of information makes no sense. I don't see any logic to the x-axis items. They're not arranged alphabetically. They're not arranged by amount. As for the y-axis, the value axis, the scale goes from what looks like maybe 90 to 5,000. But in such a compressed area, you can't really tell what the values are. And I have no idea how to read the percentages on the right in relationship to the numbers on the y-axis. This is, I think, a pretty sexy looking data display. But once we get past its sleekness, it's relatively unusable. This is a case of what I like to call just because you can doesn't mean you should. Just because you can create something like this in Word or using another tool doesn't mean you should actually create something like this. Try to figure out how many inches of rain Atlanta got in June or Dallas got in November. It's impossible. This isn't a perfect fix, in part because I can't remember the original context and audience for the data display we just looked at. But this presents the same information, rainfall total, in inches, in major U.S. cities, by month, in a much more clear way. We can actually see the data, and we can compare it much more easily. Here's another interesting bad data display. Do you have any idea what this is telling or showing us? I don't, and part of the reason is because pie charts are used to show pieces of a whole. What's the whole here? What's the big N number? We don't know. And what's this data display telling us? What's missing here is a title to help guide our reading of this data. If the chart was showing us trends in overall consumption per week, a pie chart should be used, with each day getting a slice or percentage. And here we can see overall coffee is the most popular drink consumed. If the chart is comparing consumption across a week, a bar or column chart would work much better. Here we can see that coffee consumption goes up across the week, whereas water consumption stays relatively stable. I don't even really want to talk about this. Well, okay, I'll say this. This is where the chart designer failed to use contrast well, one of the key design principles. Convention might tell us that severe versus ripe is the title, but because the title font size and face is exactly the same as the X and Y axis labels, we're left unsure. Okay, so these document designers made some poor choices. We can learn from them. Things get suspect in the next few examples. Let's look at this first one. It certainly looks here as if sales are stable. However, this is drastic scaling. The scale runs from 0 to 100 even though all the numbers are between 80 and 100. This example tells a much different story, in part, again, because the scale is skewed, this time showing us only 88 to 94. As a document designer using a tool like Word or Excel, you have complete control over the scale you use for your data displays. So be aware of how scale can change the story a graph is telling. This data display tells a story of growing monthly sales. That said, if we see this broken down by salesperson, we get some important new information. The full graph shows us that Avalos had a great month, but Noonan tanked. What this data display is revealing is difficult to discern. Again, this is where well-written, descriptive titles make a huge difference. This is an interior page for an annual report, a really important document presented by a company to its stakeholders, shareholders, government regulators, policymakers, employees, and more. Because the data display has no title, though, there's no way to quickly understand this data. And even if we dig into the text of the document, which we shouldn't necessarily have to do, the graph should tell a story on its own, we can't quite figure out what's going on here. And one last example. This is another just because you can do it doesn't mean you can. Word and Excel allow us to create wonderfully fluffy 3D charts and add all sorts of bells and whistles. The problem here, though, is the formatting obscures the data, which I think is well represented here by this chart from graphjan.com, which I encourage you to check out if you want to see some people making fun of things with graphs. I hope these two videos, the first introducing different types of graphics and suggesting when to use specific data displays, and the second sharing some bad examples, has provided some starting considerations for working with data displays, which is exactly what we'll be doing for Module 2.